Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. Wow, we're into some awesome stuff today. We've been talking about harmonization, how chord, scale, melody relationships evolve out of systems of modes, and you've been thinking, hey, wait, this stuff sounds too pretty, too normal. Where do I get that hard-edged, badass sound I hear in hard rock and blues music? Well, blues players think of music differently than diatonic players. This is lesson 24, so make sure your booklet is open to page 24. You'll also need your minor pentatonic scale chart and your slide rule. All set? Here we go. Hi. We just got finished talking about diatonic harmony. We've been on it for several hours about how the major scale and its modes, when you look at various aspects of how those modes work, how that explains a lot of chord progressions, and also what types of scales that you're supposed to use in order to create melodies over these different chord progressions. But you're thinking to yourself, when I listen to the radio most days, I hear this music that's kind of edgy, and you know, we collectively, or at least I collectively, think of this as blues playing. It's hard to think of a band like Rage Against the Machine or Limp Bizkit or Korn or Tool, if you're up on your new kind of alternative bands and things, as being blues bands. It was a little easier to think of it more in classic rock when you heard bands like Led Zeppelin or The Who or The Doors or any of the 80s and bands like Motley Crue and Iron Maiden, or the heavy metal bands like Black Sabbath and Metallica and stuff. It's hard to think of them as blues bands, but just for our purposes today, I'm kind of suggest that all of this edgy type of music owes its roots originally to that style of music that we call blues. So what we're kind of investigating today is blues music and blues harmony. And this is also where we talk a bit about pentatonic scales. Now, so far we have been talking about the diatonic scales, the 8-note per octave diatonic scales, most of which evolve in one way or another out of the major diatonic scale. A lot of you have heard that the most significant scales in popular music are pentatonic scales. I think I've indicated before that I don't believe that's anywhere near as true as a lot of people would suggest it is. When we were looking at pentatonic modes, we saw that pentatonic scales pretty much function the same way in most music anyway, function the same way as diatonic scales. Since they're pentatonic scales, they only have 5 notes per octave instead of the 7 notes in the diatonic scales. So pentatonic players are really playing using pentatonic scales a lot like diatonic scales, but they're leaving 2 notes out. And our big question was, why would you want to leave those notes out? We came to the conclusion that maybe there weren't as many good reasons as we might have thought there were. people who play pentatonically miss a lot of opportunities, really, to create more interesting melodies. Sometimes we learn that popular music is involved with pentatonic scales more because a lot of pentatonic, and if the truth be known, blues players are not necessarily the most sophisticated musicians around. They do not necessarily know, many of them, as much as you know about music theory at this point right now. Blues can be elevated to a very high art, too, involving a lot of chromatic notes. In fact, here's an interesting question for you. What do you call a chromatic blues player? A chromatic blues player is kind of like a jazz player. It is said, although in the modern age this is not so true as it used to be, it is said that blues kind of evolved, that jazz kind of evolved out of blues music. And indeed, there is a lot of blues type thinking in jazz, but there are a lot of modern players who have moved into other areas as well. But the notion that blues is all about pentatonic playing is a dramatic oversimplification. Some of you may have already investigated that or experienced that when you were told that blues players play pentatonically. But when you went and analyzed perhaps the tablature for a Stevie Ray Vaughan guitar solo or something, you noticed, hey, wait a minute. A lot of the notes these guys are playing are not notes that are in a pentatonic or a minor pentatonic scale. Nonetheless, in order to understand blues harmony as a point of departure, we do basically want to look at pentatonic scales, and specifically what we actually want to do is look at minor pentatonic scales. If you look back at your must-know list of scales, you'll notice that we had 2 pentatonic scales on that original list. We had a major pentatonic scale and we had a minor pentatonic scale. Later on, when we talked about pentatonic modes, we actually discovered that the minor pentatonic scale is the 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale. So there's that old 1-6 relationship again, that relationship between the relative major and the relative minor. Well, when you're talking about blues, the scale that is most significant to the basic understanding of how blues music works is the minor pentatonic scale. So today, our subject for today is minor pentatonic modes in this style that we call blues music. Minor pentatonic modes in blues music. Some of you are essentially addicted to this style of playing. As I said, a lot of you think that the diatonic stuff is just too pretty sounding and you need that harder edge type of stuff. I want to encourage you to develop as broad a sense of harmonic control as you ultimately can. I think those are the more interesting players ultimately in the end. But a good place to start is basic old blues music. Now, as I said before, you may have a certain amount of trouble thinking of Rage Against the Machine as a blues band. But in this context, I'm going to suggest that they basically are. And you can always tell when you're hearing blues type music. As I mentioned before, it's always got that kind of hard-edged kind of sound to it. It doesn't have the pretty kind of sound that we associate with this diatonic harmony more. A good kind of exercise is take a band like Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin is kind of nobody has trouble really thinking of Led Zeppelin as a blues band, but Led Zeppelin is a good example of a band that's in a way kind of like 50-50. Like half of their songs are blues oriented and the other half are not. Think, for example, of here's a couple of riffs from Led Zeppelin songs. You know, for example, I don't even remember which name this one is. How about this one? You remember this Led Zeppelin song? Now, that's a big funky riff, isn't it? Couldn't that just as easily be kind of like a Rage Against the Machine song, too, in the end? You know, how about... You all know that Led Zeppelin song. It's got that hard-edged type of thing. Now, contrast that with the introduction to Stairway to Heaven. which is kind of a pretty and delicate thing. It sounds almost like folk music or something like that. Doesn't have that hard edge stuff. An interesting exercise is to go through any given Led Zeppelin album and listen and try to tell which of the songs in there are more, shall we say, diatonic tunes, and which of those are the more blues-oriented tunes. Most of you will be able to tell the difference, or at least at some point in time after you get your ears trained a little more, you will be able to tell the difference. Well, you understand that difference by ear, but many blues players simply do not understand theoretically what they're doing. A lot of blues players, as I mentioned a little while ago, are not necessarily the most sophisticated musicians around. And blues music in general oftentimes is not the most sophisticated music around. Nothing wrong with that. It just isn't. A lot of blues playing, you're also going to find out, involves a lot of finger tricks and cliches on your instrument. We're going to talk about some of those things today. Things like bent notes and things like hammer-ons and pull-offs. Stuff like that. In fact, a lot of blues improvisation, a lot of people who improvise in blues music, in a way, if you ask me, aren't really improvising. They are just employing a lot of these different types of cliches that have evolved over time. Some players are stuck simply playing these cliches over and over again, simply because they don't understand music theory and they don't understand their instrument really well enough to break out of that mold. As I mentioned at the very end of my last show, I have a student right now who's just sort of in heaven because after all these years of playing blues and not understanding what he's doing and not understanding how it relates to other styles of music, he's beginning to see that now. And this is the very information that we're going to try to get you in this hour here. As I mentioned before, you can always tell, or you will always be able to tell when you're hearing blues music. It's got that hard-edged stuff. Where does that stuff come from? Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, blues players think about scale chord relationships somewhat differently than the way diatonic players play. They choose to play certain notes that diatonic players would actually not like to play. One of the things that makes blues music sound harder and more badass is it has a lot more dissonances in it, a lot more grading types of note relationships in it. And one of the things we're going to try to do is we're going to try to analyze what those things are today. Collectively, interestingly enough, the way that you know the difference between regular old diatonic music and blues music is because you are hearing blues players play what are known as blue notes. Now, have you ever heard that expression before? You ever heard of a blue note? There's even an old record company called Blue Note Records, and early blues jazz type of record label. They're still around today. Blue Note Records. A funny little joke at the classical music schools is if you're a classical musician and you play a wrong note and somebody points out to you, hey, you played a wrong note. Lots of times the joke is, no, that wasn't a wrong note. That was just a blue note. Because, some of these blue notes sound kind of ugly, and they're the thing that gives that visceral quality to blues music. A lot of people play this stuff, but they don't actually understand what's going on with it at all. Now, in order to introduce you to this sound and show you that what this is about, I on your Mode Jam tape way back when, you might recall, and I'll pull this up. You haven't seen this for a while, but when we were talking about diatonic harmony, remember we made a Mode Jam tape, that sequence of different chord progressions. Most of them were based on diatonic harmony, but then you've got this one on here, your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th chord progression on your Mode Jam tape is a 1, 4, 5 blues progression. And so when you go to practice with your flashcards to learn this blues type of playing, that is the actual chord progression that you're going to want to use. And I have that keyed up right now in my tape machine here, and I'm just going to jam for a couple of minutes on the blues, and you'll notice that you've got that harder edged type of sound and that that we're all looking for in this kind of blues playing. Let's see how I do. I'm not too well warmed up today, but here we go. So here comes a standard 1-4-5 12-bar blues. You recognize that type of playing? That could be a Metallica guitar solo as well as it could be Led Zeppelin. It could be Muddy Waters or B.B. King, that type of playing. The whole thing that gave that style of music its hard edge is that blues players choose to play different notes than diatonic players play, and these are often referred to as blue notes. My definition, therefore, of what a blue note is they are specific non-diatonic note choices that blues players choose to play that diatonic players wouldn't choose. Blue notes are specific non-diatonic note choices characteristic of this style of music that we call blues. The blues, after all, is a style. It had certain origins. I have heard things. I'm not the greatest musicologist in the world. I've heard things like it evolved out of West African enslaved music from the 19th century and into this style of music that we call the blues today. And what we're going to try to do today is we're going to try to analyze how the harmonies in blues music work and what these specific blue notes are. Now, as I've already mentioned, one thing that we have learned to associate many, many times with blues music, many of you have heard this before, you have heard that blues involve a particular type of chord progression. That is a 1-4-5 chord progression. So let's take a look at that first. One of the characteristic things about the blues is you have a 1-4-5 chord progression. Some people believe that that is what defines the blues, that blues and only blues are 1-4-5 chord progressions. But if you've been paying attention to the previous tapes, we've said so many times before, no, 1-4-5 is the most common chord progression in essentially every style of music. And it's just that 1-4-5 certainly is the backbone of standard blues type playing. Now, another thing that we want to make sure we understand is if we were looking at a 1-4-5 chord progression from the standpoint of a normal old piece of major diatonic music, would the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord be all major chords? Would they be all minor chords? Or would they be mixed? Would certain of them be major and certain of them would be minor? Can you answer that question? Pause the machine for a second. Well, the answer is, if you were playing in a major key harmonization, you might recall that that would be Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian, and the 1, 4, and the 5 would all be major chords. Now, you also know that if you were doing this in a natural minor harmonization, that 1, 4, 5 would all be minor chords, too. If you started with the natural minor scale on the 1 chord, then this would be Dorian and this would be Phrygian, so you'd have a 1, 4, 5 chord progression that was all minor. There is minor blues and there is also major blues. To really state my concept today, to in a sense overstate it, we're going to be talking about major blues. So the one thing that we want to think of right away is that we're playing a 1-4-5 progression and that each of these chords is going to be a major chord. Now, chords in the blues are not always played as major chords. Sometimes they're played as minor chords. Sometimes they aren't played as major or minor chords. They're played as power chords, which are neither major or minor by virtue of the fact that they don't have a 3 in them. Remember way back when we said that a power chord, those kind of hard-edged, hard rocky types of chords like this, or they sound angry and severe. They aren't they aren't major or minor chords because they don't have a 3rd in them. They're just 1-5-8, you might recall. And another little trick, I'll show you this about chord progressions. A lot of what you're doing in kind of standard blues type chord playing is you're taking like a power chord, 1-5-8, 1-5-8, and you're taking note number 5. And you're moving it up a whole step to become note number 6. How many millions of times have you heard a blues tune that's got stuff like that going on in it? 5, 5, 6, 6, 5, 5, 6. Now I go to the 4 chord. This is a 1, 4, 5 progression. So now I'm to the 4 chord, and I still do the 5, 5, 6, 6, 5, 5, 6, 6, 5, 5, 6, 5, 5, 6, 6. Back to the 1 chord again. Now I'm going up to the 5 chord. Oops. Then down to the 4 chord. Back to the 1 chord. So, a standard 1, 4, 5 progression. This is what I have on the tape. There is a 12-bar blues. It starts on the 1 chord. 1. And I'm shuffling this thing. Then it goes to the 4 chord. Then back to the 1 chord again. You have a chart in your booklet there that shows you a standard 12-bar blues progression. Back to the 4 chord again. In this case, that's a D in the key of A. We're doing this in the key of A. That's the 1 chord again. Now up to the 5 chord. Back to the 4 chord. And then back to the 1 chord, and then it often ends up on the 5 chord one more time. That's a kind of a standard 12-bar blues progression. That's what I'm jamming over on this tape. So, oftentimes blues music is played with power chords, not with major chords. But as I mentioned, to overstate my case here, to really show you where these blue notes are, let's for now consider that we're playing a 1-4-5 progression, and let's think of this as being a 1-4-5 progression in a normal major diatonic key. So all 3 of these chords would be major chords, right? Here's the first problem. Here's the first weird thing. If we are playing over a 1-4-5 progression that are all major chords, what the heck are we doing using a minor pentatonic scale to play with anyway? Haven't for the last several weeks we been talking about the notion that that major scales are meant to go with major chords and minor scales are meant to go with minor chords? What are we doing playing a minor scale, a minor pentatonic scale, in a progression that has nothing but major chords in it? Well, that, my friend, is the essence of the blues in the sense. This is where we get these grating, hard-edged types of notes. And we have, in a sense, just exposed some of the first of what might be called our blue notes. Let's take our first look over at this side of the page over here, and where you're going to see that I have across the top here, as we've seen so many times before, I have 2 octaves of a minor pentatonic set of intervals written out here. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. Remember, minor pentatonic scales have step-and-a-half intervals in them. They have 2. That's an augmented second interval. And you can see I drew lines on the chart here where those step-and-a-half intervals are. Those lines separating those 2 notes, or joining those 2 notes right there, are where the step-and-a-half intervals fall in this minor pentatonic scale. You know, if you've memorized your scales, that a minor pentatonic scale goes 1, flat 3, 4, 5, and then another step-and-a-half interval up to flat 7, and then to 8. Now, if we can look back over here for a moment and see that we're talking about a 1-4-5 chord progression, which is all major chords. Now, if we were thinking of this diatonically, what scale have we been led to believe that we would play over the 1 chord in this progression? We would play our good old friend, the Ionian mode, which is the good old do-re-mi scale, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It would be a major scale because this is a major chord. But this is our first little thing about the blue notes. If we look over here again, yes, this 1 chord is a major chord, but we're going to be playing a scale that has a flatted third in it, a minor pentatonic scale. We have exposed our first new big blue note. In blues music, I'm never quite sure how to describe this, but it's something like the distinction between major and minor gets somewhat blurred and introduces a considerable amount of dissonance into the music. For example, now up on the keyboard here, I'm going to play an A major chord. There's an A major chord. Here's an A major scale. There's the major third, that's C sharp. Now, that sounds very good with that A major chord, doesn't it? Because since it's a major chord, it has that C sharp in it anyway. It has that third in it anyway. Now, listen to this. I'm going to take this major third right here, and I'm going to drop it down by a half step to be the flatted third, which would be the C natural right here. Now, listen to how, in a sense, how ugly this flatted third sounds when you play it over a major chord. Wow, that sounds kind of ugly, doesn't it? Whenever you're hearing the blues, you're hearing that type of ugliness all the time. I don't mean the word ugly like in a bad way necessarily. It's dissonance is the better word. It's atonal. It's not so normally sweet sounding as the major third would sound. But this is a lot of what the blues is about. It's almost kind of an antisocial sound. It's like, we're sick of all this pretty old Mozart stuff. We want some dirt in our music. You know what I mean? This has really evolved over the course of the 20th century. People have gotten a little tired of the same old pretty classical music type stuff, and they're looking for a little more, a little more urban kind of sound. The world has evolved into an ugly place, some people would say, and music tends to reflect that. So this is the kind of back alley, dirty kind of stuff. It's got a little bit of sex in it too, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not all this pretty clean stuff. It's got this dirt in it. Flatted thirds played over major chords, which are supposed to have a major third in them. This is your first big blue note right here. And we're going to actually refer to this as, and this is very often referred to as a blues third. It's a style of music where you can mess around with the flat 3 and the 3. The other thing is I want to suggest is you're not always just hearing the flatted third in the blues either. Blues players play around with using both the flatted third and the major third. It is that dichotomy between those two notes that's known as a blues third. Some of the riffs that we play in rock and roll music and in blues music involve both the major third and the minor third. How many times have you heard like a blues rock riff that had characteristics like this? Oops. Now, notice what I'm doing here. I'm going 1, 1, flat 3. There's my flat 3 right there. 1, 1, flat 3. But then I go a half step up from there to the major third. 1, 1, flat 3, 3, 5. And then I go up to the 5. I guess that's no big mystery, is it? 1, 1, 1, flat 3, 3, 5, 5, flat 3, 3, 1, 1. That riff had both the flatted third and the major third. I went 1, 1, flat 3, 3, 5, and then I jumped up to the 5 after that. So this is what is known as a blues third, and a blues third, of course, is one of your big things that we might call a blue note. Diatonic players, classical musicians would go running out of the room with their fingers in their ears if you played a flatted third over a major chord. But in the 20th century, we've grown to embrace that particular type of dissonance in this style of music that we call blues music. And that, of course, has evolved into the harder styles of hard rock and heavy metal and stuff like that. So if we're looking over here at our minor pentatonic modes, and I'll explain the implications of why we're suggesting that there are modes at work here in just a moment. If we can look at our first chord progression up here, the 1 chord, and ask ourselves what scale we're playing over it, we're playing what I call pentatonic Aeolian, the 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale, which of course you know is a minor pentatonic scale, isn't it? 6th mode of the major pentatonic scale is the minor pentatonic scale. I've been known to call it pentatonic Aeolian. 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8, but it's more commonly known as a minor pentatonic scale. And we are trying to look inside this scale and see what notes might be classified as blue notes, and certainly one of those non-diatonic note choices that give blues that edgy, dirty sound is this flatted third right here. This is our first big blue note that we're going to look like. Diatonic players would not play a flatted third over the 1 chord in a chord progression if that was supposed to be a major chord. Every time you hear a song and you go, oh, that's a blues tune, it's because you're hearing that flatted third, that dirty sound in there. And so many people have done it for years and never knew that that's what they were doing at all. Now, another question I want to ask you is this. If you look at the minor pentatonic scale, 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, 8, do you see any other notes in there that could be construed as notes that diatonic players would not play over the 1 chord in a major key chord progression? Do you see any? I'm going to suggest that note right there, the flatted 7th. Now, a minor pentatonic scale has a flatted 7th in it. I'm going to suggest that that's another somewhat odd note choice for a diatonic player to play. It's not unprecedented. There are some what are called pieces of music that are written in dominant harmony and various other things like that where the 1 chord is liable to have a flat 7 over it. But in our knowledge of normal old diatonic music, that wouldn't happen, right? The 1 chord, the scale that goes along with the 1 chord, would be our good old friend, the Ionian mode. And remember, the Ionian mode goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It doesn't have a flat 7 in it. In normal old diatonic harmony, we do not play a flat 7 over the 1 chord. And so I'm going to suggest that this is another blue note right there. Diatonic players would not, under normal circumstances, find themselves playing a flatted 7 over a 1 chord in a diatonic chord progression. Not unprecedented, but not as common as the notes that would be in the Ionian mode. Of course, Ionian mode doesn't have a flat 7. There's another blue note right there. And I am going to suggest, if we look down here for a moment, where we're kind of listing our main blue notes over here, I'm going to suggest that another very important blue note is a flatted 7. Now, so far in our discussions of scale chord relationships, we've been saying that the major scale is the most important scale in all of music. We haven't spent an awful lot of time talking about the note, the flatted 7, have we? That may surprise some of you, again, who have taken some music theory, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you understand that flat 7 is a very important note. Even though it's not in the major diatonic scale, it's not in the Ionian mode, flat 7 turns out to be a very important note. As we go on to level number 5 of my 6 levels of theory, which is coming up next week, by the way, the whole subject of chords, we're going to find that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about flat 7. Flat 7 is a hugely important note. We just haven't gotten to the point where we've talked much about it. I tend to talk about that more from the point of view of chords, and then look backwards to what that has to do with scales and melody note choices and stuff like that. But flat 7 turns out to be a very important note, and one style of music that flat 7 is hugely important in is blues music. One thing we might suggest is that one of the defining characteristics of blues harmony is there's a lot of flat 7s in there, and not only that, they're flat 7s in places that diatonic players would not expect to find them. And we can certainly see that right over the 1 chord right there. So these 2 circles I've made are our first 2 big blue notes, our first non-diatonic note choices that give blues that characteristic sound. Now, remember, we're looking at a 1-4-5 progression here, aren't we? A lot of you have been told, again, if you think back to that argument between those 3 guys who didn't understand about modes, that one guy thinks he's playing the same scale the whole time, and the other guy says, no, each time the chord changes, you have to play a different scale. But then what we learned, the cornerstone of understanding modes, is understanding that even though it's the same notes, It's actually functioning as a completely different scale. Each of those notes has a different function depending on which of the chords you play it over. So once again, modes rears its ugly head here too. You thought you were playing a minor pentatonic scale the whole time that you were playing this 1-4-5 chord progression here. But it turns out that actually the only time you were playing the actual minor pentatonic scale was when you were playing over the 1 chord. If you continued to play that same set of notes over the 4 chord and over the 5 chord, they were no longer functioning as a minor pentatonic scale. What were they functioning as? They were functioning as the 4th and 5th mode of a minor pentatonic scale. If we can look over here again, we see that that's what's going on over here. Again, we are harmonizing, if you will, this set of intervals up here, which the first mode of which is the minor pentatonic scale itself. But when we went to the 4 chord, if we continue to play the same notes, they are no longer functioning as that minor pentatonic scale. They are functioning as the 4th mode. The root note is note number 4 of the original scale. Even though it's the same notes, now they are functioning as notes over the 4 chord. They are functioning as 1, 2, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. That is the 4th mode of the minor pentatonic scale, which is the same as our good old friend pentatonic Dorian. You might remember it's the old 2 mode of the major pentatonic scale, is pentatonic Dorian. It turns out to be the 4th mode here, which of course is a minor scale. It's sort of like the Dorian mode, but it's got a couple of notes left out of it. One of the notes that's left out is the flatted 3rd, interestingly enough. The other note that's left out is the 6th. Again, like I'm saying, I'm not encouraging you people to play the blues from a pentatonic point of view. I'm just showing you the way most people tend to think of the blues. And with a little bit of added information. For example, you're not playing, if we're doing this in the key of A, which we are, by the way, if you remember your mode jam tape is in the key of A, this is a blues progression in the key of A, which is 1-4-5 would be A, D, and E. You're playing an A major chord, a D major chord, and an E major chord. Over this A major chord, you're playing an A minor pentatonic scale, as we can see over here. But when you go to the 4 chord in the progression, you're no longer playing that. You're playing the 4th mode of that scale, which is pentatonic Dorian, missing the flat 3 and the 6 in it. 1, 2, 4, 5, flat 7, 8. Now, what we would like to do is look at this mode and see if we see any specific non-diatonic note choices here that we could maybe be construed as blue notes. Well, remember, if this was a normal old diatonic chord progression, if this was the 4 chord, this would be the Lydian mode, right? And you might recall that Lydian is a major scale that goes 1, 2, 3, sharp 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's what diatonic players would play over the 4 chord. But do you see anything here that's out of that set? Well, interestingly enough, look once again. In pentatonic Dorian is a flat 7. Now, there is no flat 7 in the Lydian mode. Diatonic players would not be playing a flat 7 over the 4 chord under normal circumstances. I'm oversimplifying dramatically here to make my point. But nonetheless, I'm going to suggest that once again, flat 7 asserts itself as being a non-diatonic note choice that blues players play all the time. And another note that might be construed as a blue note is note number 4 here. I'm stretching it a little bit here. But remember, this is Lydian mode, and Lydian mode does not contain note number 4. It contains a sharp 4. So when we're playing the 4th mode of the minor pentatonic scale over this 4 chord here, that 4 could be construed as a non-diatonic note choice because an awful lot of diatonic music would have explored the usage of the sharp 4 instead of the 4. So once again, if we line this up to the way note choices are made strictly in diatonic music, we've got a couple of oddball notes in there, notes that add grit, or notes that add dirt, and that's what we've come to like in this century is these notes. So we're up to like 4 blue notes here, and we're seeing the flatted 3rd again. By the way, if that was pentatonic Dorian, and in fact, if we had played this as a true Dorian scale, we would have had a flatted 3rd in there. That could be almost construed essentially as another blue note in there too. But a lot of times, if you're just playing pentatonically, you're not playing that stuff anyway. So. Now, in the next moment in this 12-bar blues song, we go to the 5 chord. 1, 4, 5 progression. That's also should be thought of as a major chord. If we were playing diatonically, we would be playing a Mixolydian scale over this 5 chord. It's a major chord. Mixolydian is a major scale. For those of you, hopefully you don't have this memorized yet, Mixolydian goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7. In other words, it's a major scale with a flatted 7 in it. Now, here, over the 5 chord, in this blues music, we are not playing Mixolydian mode. We are playing the 5th mode of the minor pentatonic scale. That scale, which we could call pentatonic Phrygian, is a minor scale. We know that Phrygian is a minor scale. We have a flatted 3rd right then. But remember, this is a major chord, isn't it? What the heck are we doing playing a flatted 3rd over a major chord? There's our old blues 3rd again, over the 5 chord. Blues players, even though it's kind of like a major chord, are apt to play a flatted 3rd there. And that's what gives it that really hard, edgy kind of sound. Now, another kind of odd note here is this sharp 5. You know what I mean? It just isn't what a diatonic player would play. Mixolydian mode is a pretty normal scale. It has note number 5 in it. What the heck are we doing playing this sharp 5 over this chord? Well, there's another one of your blue notes right there. This is the difference between why blues sounds the way it does and diatonic music sounds the way it does. Now, notice this. This mode here, the 5th mode of the minor pentatonic scale, also contains a flatted 7, doesn't it? In both of these other cases, flatted 7 turned out to be a blue note, didn't it? Well, I'm going to suggest in this particular case that flat 7, in a way, isn't a blue note. Because if we were playing diatonically, the 5 chord would probably have a flat 7 played over it anyway, wouldn't it? Because the 5 chord would have the 5th diatonic mode played over it. That's Mixolydian mode. If you notice, Mixolydian has a flat 7 in it, so that is not a non-diatonic note choice in this case. Flat 7 you might expect to be playing over the 5 chord in a normal piece of diatonic music. However, I'm still going to draw a circle around it and suggest that that's a blue note right there, because my overall point is that flat 7 is a characteristic note in the blues anyway. Any way you slice it, flat 7 is a blue note. It is one of the pitches, and you're going to ear train all this stuff eventually so that you know what all this stuff sounds like. Flat 7 is one of those notes that gives the blues its characteristic sound. It is, after all, a blue note. And there you go. There it is right there. Some really odd note choices that blues players play, including, I want to show you, I want to just tell you a funny little story about this sharp 5 right here. It's a pretty horrendous note. I'm going to go back to the keyboard for a second here. Here's a major chord. And again, we're in the key of A, so I'm playing an A major chord. The 5 of A is E. So up here, I'm going to play this E melody note over this A major chord. Now, that sounds like a pretty good note, doesn't it? Very successful melody note. Now, that's what you hear most of the time played over standard major or minor, for that matter, chords that have 5s in them. So not an unexpected melody note would be the 5. Sounds very good and very successful. Now listen to this sharp 5, though. Boy, that's a pretty hallucious sounding note, isn't it? A lot of dirt in that. Boy, like I say, a lot of the classical people would go running out of the room with their fingers in their ears. What a weird note choice that is. Every time you hear a blues player playing, you hear them utilizing that note. It's a blue note. The funny thing is, as I mentioned before, now, don't get me wrong, I love the blues, but the blues can be a very primitive and not terribly sophisticated style of music, and many blues players don't know a lot of music theory, ultimately, and if you ask me, it just sort of keeps them stuck where they are, but, you know, a lot of people love the blues on the other hand, too. But like I said, a funny little thing that I have in the back of my mind sometimes is if I went out to a club one night and there was a blues player playing there, and after the show was over, I invited him to come back over to my house for a little while. If I sat him down and I said to him, hey, what do you think? Do you think that if I played this chord and then played this note, this sharp 5 here over it, do you think that would be a good melody note? My sense is a lot of people would, the blues players themselves would be sitting there going, "Oh, that sounds terrible." And I would wind up pointing out to them that they just played that same note just like that all night long. You know what I mean? This is the difference between people who know their theory and have trained ears and the people who don't. When I play that sharp 5, it's because that's just that little bit of dirt that I want to hear. But I will also stick the 5 in, too. I'm a chromatic blues player. So are all the great blues players. Anyone who ever told you that all Stevie Ray Vaughan does is, or Eric Clapton does, or Muddy Waters or B.B. King, anyone who ever told you all they did was play the notes that are in a minor pentatonic scale, they didn't give you correct information. That's not true at all. This minor pentatonic orientation is just a point of departure from playing blues music, and these blue notes are just some of the arsenal of different note relationships that blues players can bring to their music in order to create that dirty kind of sound. But there are plenty of other scales and plenty of other choices all the way out to trying to take a chromatic orientation towards playing the blues. But I want to tell you another scale that you'll see would be a very useful scale to be able to use in the blues too. You might have heard this, some of you, and again, you've been confused about this stuff for years. I know a lot of you have. These are all major chords, right? A 1-4-5 progression. Well, as we said, the blues third implies that sometimes you're going to be playing a flatted third, but it doesn't mean you always have to play the flatted third. Sometimes you're going to be playing the major third too. As a matter of fact, that would be a more normal thing to do because these are all major chords. Well, can you think of a scale that is a major scale, but it has this other blue note in it? It has this flat 7 in it? What very famous scale have we talked about so many times before that is a major scale with a flatted 7? It's Mixolydian, right? Mixolydian comes up once again. You might have heard this and not understood why it was, but Mixolydian is another very common scale that you hear in blues music. First of all, it's cool because it's a diatonic scale. It's got 8 notes in it, so you pick up a couple of extra notes that the pentatonic players aren't using. Not only that, you're playing the major portion of the blues third, which would line up maybe a little bit more with how the chords actually work, plus you're integrating that flatted 7 as well. The minor pentatonic scale is not the only scale that you use in the blues. Mixolydian is also a very important scale in the blues too, because of its flatted 7 in it. Not only that, again, like I say, we're going out to the notion that ultimately, if we're truly understanding what's going on in any of these styles of music, we could become a chromatic player as well. There is, however, another thing that I want to mention too, which some of you have heard of a scale called a blues scale. That you've been told that there is a specific scale that goes along with blues music. Again, if you ask me, this is something of an oversimplification. And many people are confused about what a blues scale actually is. I'm not sure I have the answer either. I think different people have different opinions about this. I'll tell you what I think a blues scale is. Some people think that a blues scale is a minor pentatonic scale. And that is our point of departure, but then you'll also hear that other people say that a blues scale is actually a minor pentatonic scale with a couple of other notes added to it, and I'll show you where those notes are right now. For example, here is my minor pentatonic scale again, and so many of you are familiar with this box, I'm sure, on the neck of the guitar. It's maybe one of the first ones that your next door neighbor's older brother ever showed you, a minor pentatonic scale on the neck of the guitar. You now know that the notes that are in that are 1, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 7, and 8. So many rock and roll riffs, don't they sound like they come out of that scale? That's a minor pentatonic scale. Now, what a lot of people call a blues scale is a minor pentatonic with a couple of other chromatic notes added to it. And here's where the most commonly suggested ones are. 1, flat 3, 4, just like in a minor pentatonic scale, and your 5 is right here. But a lot of blues players add this little chromatic note in between, which, of course, depending on how you think of it, is either the sharp 4 or the 5. I think we're actually better thinking of it as the sharp 4 in this case. So you hear, instead of, you hear this. They add that other chromatic note in between there. Well, that's reminding me of some Black Sabbath song that I can think of. Oh, we're like... So, another little blue note that we might mention that is a characteristic note, oftentimes seen in the blues, if we could look over here, is this little note that is snuck in between the 4 and the 5 over there. That is a sharp 4, a flat 5. It's a little chromatic note which many blues players use. Now, you'll also notice that I also did that on the next string over. I stuck another little chromatic note in there when I was playing that Black Sabbath riff. On this string, I used to be going from flat 7 up a whole step to 8. But a lot of blues players add that note, that chromatic note in between there. That's actually the 7 if you think about it. If that's flat 7 and that's 8, then in between is the flat 7. That on our chart here is actually this note in between the flat 7 and the 8. That turns out to be another blue note that blues players often play and stick into their melodies in order to, it's not just minor pentatonic. Whoever told you that was not telling you what's really going on in blues playing. Now, that note carries down into the other modes as well. For example, that little chromatic blue note right down there over the 4 chord would function as the flatted 2nd. And so we hear that sometimes. Here, in the 5th mode, that note would carry down to be actually note number 7 again. So that's, another characteristic note over the 5 chord that we hear as a blue note a lot of times. This 7 here would translate down to be the sharp 4 again in between those two notes played over the 4th mode right there. And it would also actually carry down to be a major 3rd in the 5th mode right there too. So I'm going to suggest what a blues scale actually is a minor pentatonic scale with 2 chromatic notes added to it. So it goes 1, flat 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, flat 7, 7, 8. That, I think, is kind of what a blues scale probably is. You're going to run into a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions. Different people have different ideas of what actually constitutes a blue note, too. As I've mentioned, I think I've got one of the better definitions. I think a blue note is a specific non-diatonic note choice, which we're very clearly able to analyze from looking at what types of scales diatonic players would play over these and exposing these circled blue notes over here, and then some of these additional little chromatic notes that blues players typically throw in there. Now, what I want to alert you to is when you are playing your with your mode jam tape, as we mentioned, you have a blues progression on there. The 5th progression on your mode jam tape is a blues progression. Therefore, one of the big sets of scale fingerings that you're going to want to be looking at are, eventually you'll want to look at some diatonic aspects of that. For example, we mentioned Mixolydian mode, so you might have that sheet out too and trying to play the blues, utilizing some things about Mixolydian mode. But certainly one of your most important scale charts that you're going to be using to play the blues is this minor pentatonic finger chart right here. Once again, if you remember how the color coding system works, the red dots are the root notes in each of these different boxes. Since your mode jam tape is in A, since you're playing a 1-4-5 blues progression in the key of A, you want to, once again, here's a whole new set of finger patterns for you to learn. And where do you locate them on the neck in order to play an A minor pentatonic scale? You have to locate them on the neck wherever the red dot turns out to be an A. Now, I'll show you what I mean. You see this box right here, number 5? Maybe we can zoom in on number 5 right there. This is probably the first minor pentatonic box that most of you ever learned. Right there. Doesn't that look familiar? Didn't your next door neighbor's older brother show you that one time years ago? And you've been playing the blues with that box ever since. The one right next to it, actually, here, number 8, is also a very common one, too. Some of these that have, remember, there are pentatonic versions of these scales that have various finger shifts in them. And a lot of blues players kind of shy away from those. They try to play the ones that just have no finger shifts, like number 5 and number 8. These are two of the most common ones. And an awful lot of electric rock blues is played with minor pentatonic box number 5 here. Now, this is a minor pentatonic scale. If I wanted to convert this into a blues scale, I would wind up adding a couple of additional notes. Those were those chromatic notes I just showed you a moment ago. On this chart right here, it would be that note and that note. Right there, this note and this note and this note are other blue notes. You can translate that over to your different charts there, too, as you want. Your ears will eventually do all this stuff for you anyway. But let me suggest that the difference between the colored dots and then the ones that I just wrote in is, to my mind, the difference between a minor pentatonic scale and a blues scale. These are those additional sharp 4s and 7s that the blues players add in. So, if I didn't manage to convince you of this before, you have a whole new bunch of finger patterns that you've got to memorize. You really got to get in there, learn your minor pentatonic scales. I do actually have a finger chart for blues scales that contain all those additional notes, too. I just got to the studio today, and I discovered I didn't have it with me. So I just modified that one there. But you will also notice that you have a blues scale finger chart in your booklet there as well. Now, last thing I want to tell you about the blues is this. There is an awful lot more to know about the blues than this right here. Blues is a huge style of music. You have tons of stuff that you want to learn about the blues. There's not much more that I'm going to wind up telling you. I hope that this doesn't disappoint you. Just when we were getting to the stuff that is some of the music that you're most enamored of, I don't have an awful lot more to tell you about the blues, except this. Blues, and I'm going to show you a couple of little techniques here that you'd want to know about blues playing. Blues is a style of music that's very much caught up in cliches and finger tricks. And some of these are worthwhile little techniques that I should mention if you don't already know about them. 3 in particular: bent notes, hammer-ons, and pull-offs. Let me quickly show you what those are. Bent notes, which you hear a lot of in the blues, are when you take a note on the guitar and you bend the string to change its pitch. When you bend the string, you make the string tighter and you raise its pitch. Notice how I'm using all 4 fingers. Even though this is the finger that's defining the pitch of this string, I'm using all 4 fingers to push with so that I have more leverage that I can bring to the string. A lot of blues playing involves an awful lot of bluesy bent notes. To my mind, it's kind of just a finger trick. There's nothing cosmically significant about blues bends. One thing to realize is when you bend a note, under normal circumstances in any style of music, you are not bending that note to some weird arbitrary place. There are basically 2 types of bends. There are half-step bends, where really all you're doing is bending the note so it'll sound like the note that's on the next fret. Here's a half-step interval. Here's a half-step bend. So all I'm doing is another way of approaching that note. I'm not bending to some weird place. I'm bending a half step. There are also whole step bends. I just have to bend the string a little further. Whoops. So bends, there's no really big crazy thing about those. There are just cliched kinds of usages of bends. Now, another very important technique, finger trick technique for blues, is what's known as a hammer-on. You might have heard of these before. This is where you don't actually pluck a note. You actually just whack your finger on the neck hard enough so that the neck sounds, and you can actually do a whole string of hammer-ons like this. Notice that my picking hand is free here. I'm not using my pick other than to pluck the first note. See, my pick hand is free. I am just whacking that finger on hard enough. That's what I'm hammering that note on. That's what's known as a hammer-on. And a lot of blues, you use a lot of hammer-on type style things too. Actually, you use these things in other styles of music as well. Now, the opposite of a hammer-on is a thing called a pull-off, which is where you pluck a note and then you remove your finger from the neck in such a way that as the finger is leaving, it actually kind of plucks the note. And what I was actually doing a moment ago was some hammer-on pull-off combinations. See, I'm not plucking these notes at all. I just plucked the first one. Everything I'm doing right now, I'm just doing, see, I can touch the top of my head and I'm still playing the guitar because I'm hammering on and pulling off up here. A lot of blues playing involves these finger tricks, hammer-ons, pull-offs, and bends. And it is kind of beyond the scope of this program to really talk about that. I may talk about it a little bit next time, but I want to move on to the subject of chords next time. If you're interested in all this finger trick, cliche, stuff in blues playing, there are plenty of resources that you have for finding that stuff from other places. There are thousands of books, thousands of videotapes. You can send away and rent a videotape that will show you all of Stevie Ray Vaughan or Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton's little finger tricks. That's a good way to learn the blues. Okay, I am going to talk about that a little more next time because I did kind of run out of time with that and it's so important. But you can get that stuff from other sources. Until next time, which we're going to start to talk about chords, this is Scotty West. Have a great time. We'll see you next time, okay?